Christmas Eve, 1914. Private Clifford Lane is standing in a waterlogged trench in northern France, soaked to the waist, plastered in mud, trying to make the most of a bad job. He is 20 years old. He has been in France long enough to know what the sound of a sniper's shot means, and what the ground between the trenches looks like when the light is right, and what it smells like after a warm spell. Across 150 yards of frozen no-man's land, German soldiers are singing. Lanterns are rising above the enemy parapet. Someone is shouting across in English. And then the order comes down the line, passed from man to man in the dark, open rapid fire. So Clifford Lane and his battalion, the 1st Hertfordshire Regiment, one of the finest disciplined units in the British Expeditionary Force, do as they are told. They shoot out the German lanterns. The Germans do not fire back. They simply carry on celebrating, lit candles glowing behind the parapet, songs rising into the cold night air, ignoring the men across the wire completely. Lane and his comrades stay in their wet trenches and stare at the darkness. 50 years later, Clifford Lane will say it was one of the great regrets of his life. 2 miles away, other British soldiers are already climbing out of their trenches. They are stepping over wire, crossing the frozen ground between the lines, walking toward men who were trying to kill them yesterday. They will shake hands. They will share cigarettes. One of them will have his hair cut by a German barber who had served him in London before the war. Some of them will spend Christmas morning burying their dead together in the frozen earth. And then, in a few days, they will go back to killing each other. This is the story of both of those things. And the question that neither the soldiers who were there, nor the historians who came after them, have ever fully resolved, in that frozen December, which act took more courage? To understand what happened at Christmas 1914, you have to understand what the 5 months before it had done to the men involved. The war that had begun in August with cavalry charges and regimental colors and the expectation of swift, decisive victory had, by December, produced something none of its architects had planned for and none of its soldiers had been prepared to endure. The First Battle of Ypres alone, fought through October and November in the mud of Belgian Flanders, had cost the British and Commonwealth forces close to 60,000 casualties. It had effectively destroyed the pre-war British Expeditionary Force as a professional body. The men who had trained for years, who knew their trades, who formed the institutional spine of the British Army, a significant portion of them were dead or wounded before Christmas. What remained in the trenches by December was a mixture of survivors, new drafts, and territorial units, men who had come to France with varying levels of preparation and found, uniformly, that nothing had prepared them for this. The trench line by that point stretched roughly 475 miles from the North Sea coast to the Swiss border. An unbroken scar across the face of Western Europe, dug into farmland and woodland and the outskirts of towns that had existed for centuries. In many sectors, British and German trenches were separated by as little as 30 yards. Close enough to hear the men opposite cooking their food. Close enough to smell their fires. Close enough to shout across in the dark and be answered. This proximity worried the British High Command for reasons that went beyond the tactical. General Sir Horace Smith-Dorrien had written a confidential memo on December 5, 3 weeks before Christmas, warning his corps commanders that troops in close contact with the enemy slide very easily, if permitted to do so, into a live-and-let-live theory of life. The danger, in Smith-Dorrien's assessment, was not that soldiers would refuse to fight. It was that prolonged proximity to the enemy as a human being made killing him feel different than it had in training. The memo was marked confidential. It was not shared with the men in the trenches. Those men had already developed their own accommodations with the reality of their situation. In quiet sectors along the line, informal understandings had emerged between opposing units, arrangements that were never acknowledged, never written down, and never reported up the chain of command. Breakfast time was, by unspoken agreement in certain sectors, not a time for sniping. Ration parties moving along communication trenches were not targeted if they moved predictably. Repair parties working on trench walls after dark were given a margin of tolerance. None of this was policy. None of it was authorized. It was simply what happened when men who had no particular quarrel with each other were placed 30 yards apart in the mud and told to kill each other indefinitely. Then, on Christmas Eve, the Germans placed Christmas trees along their parapet. Small fir trees, sent to the men at the front from home, with candles fixed to the branches. The light from those candles was visible from the British trenches, a row of small warm glows in the darkness, at the top of the enemy parapet, in a place where nothing warm had appeared for months. The Germans began to sing. Still nacked, carried across the frozen ground between the lines. Pope Benedict XV had formally appealed for an official Christmas ceasefire on December 7, asking that the guns might fall silent at least on the night the angels sang. Every government involved in the war had officially rejected the appeal. No military command on either side authorized what was about to happen. What happened next was not ordered by anyone. It was not planned. It spread across roughly 100 miles of front line through a combination of German initiative, British curiosity, and the accumulated weight of 5 months of shared misery pressing against the manufactured idea that the men across the wire were something other than men. Not everywhere. Not uniformly. And not without cost. Along the same front line, on the same night, other men were dying. The truce, when it came, was never the whole story. It was always only part of it. The first men to climb out did so knowing exactly what it meant to show yourself above a parapet. For 5 months, appearing above the trench line had meant death. Snipers on both sides had spent the autumn calibrating their positions, learning the sight lines, identifying the gaps in the sandbag walls where a silhouette might appear. Men had been killed looking over the top to check the weather. And yet, on Christmas Eve and Christmas morning, across roughly 100 miles of the Western Front, soldiers began to do precisely that: to stand up, to climb out, to walk across the ground where their comrades had been shot and left to lie for weeks. Lieutenant Johannes Niemann of the 133rd Saxon Regiment had placed a Christmas tree on the parapet of his dugout and begun singing Still Nacked with his men. On the British side, a Seaforth Highlander later wrote that his regiment listened spellbound as German voices carried across the frozen turnip field between the lines. The harmonies rose and fell in the darkness. Nobody fired. Then somebody climbed out. And then someone on the other side walked toward him. And then there were 2 men standing in no man's land in the dark, and neither of them was dead. Lieutenant Edward Hulse of the Scots Guards walked out to meet the German officers opposite. He shook hands. He spoke with them. And when he came back, he sat down and wrote his mother an 8-page letter, one of the longest and most remarkable pieces of personal testimony to survive the entire war. The Germans were extraordinarily nice people, Hulse wrote. It is a sentence that stops you cold when you read it in context, written by a professional soldier, describing the men his battalion had been killing and would go back to killing, in a letter posted from a trench in northern France in December 1914. It is not the sentence of a man who had forgotten what he was there for. It is the sentence of a man who had just encountered an inconvenient fact. Hulse was killed in action in March 1915. He was 25 years old. What the men found when they walked into no man's land was, in many accounts, the thing that proved most difficult to process afterward: that the enemy was simply not what the propaganda said he was. Over 80,000 Germans had lived and worked in England before the war: waiters, hotel staff, barbers, tradespeople. Private Archibald Stanley encountered a German soldier who greeted him in a London accent. "I said to him, 'You speak English?'" Stanley recalled. "You know what he said?" "Cor blimey mate," he said, "I was in a London hotel when the war broke out." The football match, the part of the Christmas truce that history has most firmly retained, was, by the testimony of the men who were there, considerably less organized than the legend suggests. Private Ernie Williams of the 6th Cheshire Regiment was direct about it: it was a proper football. But we didn't form a team, it wasn't a team game in any sense of the word. You know, it was a kickabout. Everybody was having a go. The ball, he said, came from the German side. German Lieutenant Kurt Zamisch described a match against a Scottish unit ending 3-2 to Germany. Though no referee existed, no rules had been agreed, and the pitch was frozen mud-strewn with wire and shell craters. What the football meant was not the score. It was the fact of it. Men who had been living in holes in the ground for 5 months, who had watched their friends die in those holes, who had spent the autumn learning to kill efficiently and systematically, those men were kicking a ball around in the space between the trenches, in their army boots, in their greatcoats, laughing. The truce had its practical dimensions too, and they were not hidden. Both sides used the pause to bury men who had been lying in no man's land for weeks, bodies that could not be retrieved under fire, that had been visible from the trenches for so long they had become a feature of the landscape. British and German soldiers dug graves together in the frozen ground on Christmas morning, said what words seemed appropriate, and placed crude markers. One British officer recorded that the two sides prayed over the dead together, in two languages, neither group understanding the other's words. A British intelligence map compiled on December 28 shows the position of every German regiment facing the British line in one sector, information gathered, in part, from conversations held during the truce. Even moments of grace were noted and filed and used. And in the sectors where the truce never came, where the order to fire had been obeyed, where the snipers had never stood down, where Christmas Day looked like every other day, men were still dying. Private Percy Huggins of the 1st Hertfordshire Regiment was 23 years old. In the same sector where Clifford Lane's battalion had shot out the German lanterns on Christmas Eve, Huggins went to his guard post 20 meters from the German trench on Christmas Day. A sniper killed him. His last letter home had thanked his mother for the Christmas pudding. The men who commanded the British Expeditionary Force did not learn about the Christmas truce from official reports. They learned about it the way commanders always learn about things their subordinates have done without authorization, through rumor, through observation, through the sudden and suspicious quiet that settled over sectors that had been registering fire the day before. Sir John French, Commander-in-Chief of the BEF, was not pleased. Orders went out forbidding fraternization. Local commanders were required to account for what had happened in their sectors. The implicit message was clear: this was a breach of discipline, and it would not be repeated. The German army's response was more explicit. On December 29, 4 days after Christmas, the German High Command issued a formal order stating that any approach to the enemy would be punished as treason. Not discouraged. Not officially frowned upon. Punished as treason, the most severe category of military offense, carrying the most severe possible penalties. Both commands had arrived at the same conclusion by different paths, that what had happened was dangerous. Not because the men had stopped fighting for a few days. Because they had looked at each other. Private George Ashurst recorded what happened when his officers spotted him fraternizing and ordered the guns to restart the war. The generals behind must have seen it and got a bit suspicious, so what they did, they gave orders for a battery of guns behind us to fire, and a machine gun to open out and officers to fire their revolvers at the Jerrys. Course that started the war again. We were cursing them to hell, cursing the generals, and that, you want to get up here in this stuff, never mind your giving orders, in your big chateaus and driving about in your big cars. We hated the sight of the bloody generals. It is worth sitting with that sentence. These were not mutinous men. George Ashurst was not a revolutionary. He was a private soldier who had done what he was told for 5 months and would continue to do so for years more, through gas attacks and offensives and everything else the war had in store. The rage he describes is not the rage of a man who has decided war is wrong. It is the rage of a man who has just been ordered back into the mud by someone who was not in the mud, and who knows, with absolute certainty, that the person giving the order will not be in the mud tonight either. There is a reported account of a young German dispatch runner who witnessed fraternization in his sector and was contemptuous of it, who reportedly said words to the effect that such behavior showed no German sense of honor, that it should not happen in wartime. The dispatch runner's name was Adolf Hitler. Whether the account is precisely accurate or not, and the sourcing requires verification, it represents a genuine division within both armies that the popular memory of the Christmas truce tends to smooth over. Not every soldier wanted the truce. Not every soldier who witnessed it found it moving. Some found it disturbing. Some found it incomprehensible. Some on both sides stayed in their trenches not because they were ordered to, but because they could not see the point of shaking hands with a man you intended to kill on December 26. Those men were not wrong either. The machinery of high command moved efficiently to ensure the Christmas truce of 1914 remained unique. In 1915, artillery batteries on both sides were ordered to conduct bombardments on Christmas Day specifically to prevent any repeat of what had happened. Units that had participated in the truce were rotated out of their positions and replaced with fresh troops who had no personal connections, no shared memory, no quiet agreements with the men across the wire. The calculation was coldly logical. The live and let live system that General Smith-Dorrien had warned about in his December 5 memo was a real phenomenon, and it had just produced the most dramatic illustration anyone could have imagined of the risks it posed. The solution was to ensure that soldiers in the trenches did not know each other. Not as units. Not as neighbors. And especially not as human beings who had once kicked a football around in no man's land while the light lasted. By Christmas 1915, the mood along most of the Western Front had changed in ways that made the fraternization of 1914 feel, to the men who had survived to that point, like something that had happened in a different war. The Gallipoli campaign had come and gone. The Second Battle of Ypres had introduced poison gas. The planning for what would become the Battle of the Somme was already underway. The men who had shaken hands across the wire in December 1914 were, many of them, no longer alive. Most of the men who shook hands on Christmas Day 1914 were shooting at each other again by December 26. Lieutenant Edward Hulse, who wrote 8 pages about extraordinarily nice German soldiers, was dead by March. The men of the 6th Cheshires who had kicked a football around in the mud went back into their trenches, picked up their rifles, and continued the work they had briefly set aside. The truce did not shorten the war by a single hour. It did not save a single life that the war subsequently claimed. The men who participated did not go home because of it. Most of them stayed in those trenches for years more, through the gas at Ypres in April 1915, through the Somme in 1916, through Passchendaele in 1917, through everything the war still had in reserve for them. Clifford Lane said he regretted staying in his trench. He carried that regret for 50 years, and it was genuine, and it deserves to be taken seriously. But Lane's battalion had been fighting for months. They had watched comrades die in that same ground. The officers who passed the order to open rapid fire were not cruel men, and they were not stupid men. They believed, and the historical record does not easily refute them, that the ability to kill the enemy when killing was necessary depended on not knowing him too well. That softening the man across the wire into a person with a face and a name and a London accent made the next morning's work harder in ways that would cost lives. That the men already buried in that frozen ground deserved to have their deaths mean something, and that meaning required the killing to continue. That argument has a logic to it. It is not a comfortable logic. But it is not an empty one. Bruce Bairnsfather, the cartoonist officer who went out into no man's land on Christmas Day and came back and wrote about it and kept writing about the war for years afterward, put the contradiction as plainly as anyone ever has. There was not an atom of hate on either side that day, he wrote, and yet, on our side, not for a moment was the will to war and the will to beat them relaxed. Both things were true simultaneously. The men shaking hands in no man's land had not stopped believing the war needed to be won. The men who stayed in their trenches and fired on the lanterns had not stopped being capable of exactly the same humanity. The Christmas truce of 1914 did not reveal a hidden truth beneath the surface of the war. It revealed that the surface and what lay beneath it were the same thing, that men could grieve and kill and laugh and bury their dead and kick a football and go back to trying to destroy each other, not in sequence, but all at once, as part of the same experience. The question the truce poses, which it has posed for over 100 years, is not whether the men who crossed no man's land were braver than the men who stayed put, or more moral, or more fully human. It is whether the thing Bairnsfather described is possible to sustain, to see the man across the wire as a man, and still do what the war requires of you when morning comes. The soldiers of December 1914 did not answer that question. They lived it. The ones who survived carried it home with them and mostly did not talk about it, because there were no adequate words for it, and because the people they came home to had not been there and could not quite be made to understand. History remembers the football match. It tends to forget that the match was played between the graves.